welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Brian.
And this is the Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian faith. Now, you looked us up on ChatGPT the other day, didn't you?
It was Google. Google has an AI now.
Oh,
or whatever.
Google AI. And what did it say, Brian?
And it said, a podcast. It is a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and
other things.
Other things related. No, other things. I can't remember.
Other things about the Christian faith, or
about
something.
The Christian faith, something like that. I was actually thinking
and
about.
I said, I blame you
for confusing AI.
Yeah.
Well, the good news is, if Terminator ever happens, then I'm going to take it down. I'll just.
By what? Confusing it?
I'll match it in a battle of wits.
You have confused.
It'll pull out this big gun, and I'll go, oh, but you've never matched a Sicilian in a battle of wits.
This is not the Princess.
Have you ever heard of Plato, Socrates? Morons.
Brian's like, have you heard this word before?
Pertain.
Take that, AI.
Okay,
anyway, we're back. We're wrapping up.
Leviticus.
We're wrapping up Leviticus, he says as he rubs his eye. Oh no, Leviticus. All right, so we're wrapping up Leviticus,
Yeah.
Levitici. And so we've had a lot of episodes. Not a lot of episodes. We've had
it's not been that many.
Five,
It just
six.
seems like it.
It just seems like it's taken forever. Boy, isn't that the truth? So we're wrapping up Leviticus here, but we hope it's been helpful for you and to think about this and useful for you. So Brian, take us home here. We're on the home stretch here.
Well, these last 5 chapters I've titled they're dealing with worshiping God, and the first part of them is very interesting stuff. It's about the yearly festivals that would take place. That were part of the regular schedule, the regular worship of the Israelites. We mentioned in our last episode it was the weekend of Easter. This is one of those yearly commemorations, and of course, Easter, our celebration of Jesus' resurrection, is tied directly to one of these Jewish feasts, Passover. Right, so there are certain times of the year for us as Christians as well that we celebrate, but it was even more of it was a bigger deal, I would say, in some ways for the Jewish people. You know, some of these were pilgrimage festivals. In other words, people would, if you're a devout Jew, you would go up to Jerusalem in order to participate in them. They had 7 days. There was a lot going on here, and so we're going to talk about special times of worship. And then we're going to talk also about some other things. And then there's one more little narrative, just like you remember we had Nadab and Abihu kind of stuck in the middle of that, earlier thing.
Those rascally priests.
Offering up that strange fire. We're going to have a similar kind of thing that I think draws attention again to some things that we need to take seriously. But all of this, again, remember what we're looking at when we look at Leviticus, just taking us back to the beginning here as well, is we're thinking, what does this teach us about God? And I think, you and I both have been reading this book by Byung-Chul Han, The Disappearance of Rituals.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he talks about is how important rituals are. In other words, having things like these regular practices that we participate in, it gives us, so to speak, a place in time. It gives us something to hold on to, a piece of stability.
Yeah, he references it like how things make a house a home. Like how we surround ourselves. Like rituals help us find our place in time. It makes time a home in time.
Yeah, and I think that's true because you know how it is. If you have these long stretches, what's the meme that everybody does? It's like these months have this many days, except for January, which has 467 days. It feels like
right. January goes forever.
It stretches on and on. It's gray every day, that kind of thing. When we have these, I think that's one of the reasons the weekly meeting is still so important for us, to get together at the beginning of our week as Christians and kind of in a sense, the very first part of our week, we're dedicating it to God, and it helps ground us, I think, in time, in a sense. So that's part of what we're going to see. We're going to see a few other regulations and some things thrown in. But let's start with chapter 23. Read verses 1 and 2. This is kind of the beginning introduction here for this whole thing.
Yeah. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, these are my appointed festivals, the appointed festivals of the Lord, which you are to proclaim same as sacred assemblies.
That word sacred assembly is one that we're going to see over and over again. Sacred has, again, the same idea of being set apart. It's the same Hebrew word that would be used for holy, and it's this idea of a set apart time, a time where you gather together in a sacred way. And so that's what we have. The first one is the Sabbath. So here's what it says in Leviticus. And then you go ahead and look at Exodus chapter 20 for me. This is in the middle of the giving of the Ten Commandments, of course. Here's what it says in Leviticus. There are 6 days when you may work, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest, a day of sacred assembly. There's that phrase again. You're not to do any work wherever you live. It is a Sabbath to the Lord. And so here's the idea that seventh day, that last day, is supposed to be set apart to God, and in particular, it's a day of rest for the Jewish people. The Sabbath is a day of rest. Go ahead and read what it says in Exodus. A little bit more details given here.
Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy.
So it's interesting. A couple of things I wanted you to notice here. The first is just kind of culturally. If you look at the ancient world, the Jews were very, the ancient Israelites, I'll put it this way, were very unique in the sense that they were unique. I guess I should say. I don't like very unique. That was kind of dumb, but they were unique.
You stand no chance.
In that they have these prescribed times of rest. And it gives us a different perspective on things when you set apart one part of your week in order not to work, right? It's an absence of work. It's a separation from work. But it was an active time in this sense. It was a time where they were supposed to contemplate their relationship to God and their relationship to creation, is the way that we see it referred to later. That was one thing. Just the idea that what an interesting thing it is that they had this prescribed time of rest. And we're going to see that there's other parts of that as well. The second thing is this. Notice that in that what you read in Exodus, it is directly connected with the 7 days of creation. On 6 days, God created the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh, he rested. And I always, when I would teach this, I would always say to students, what do you think? God was tuckered out. The all-powerful God was tired at the end of 6 days, and he needed a break. I'm going to rest for. What does it mean that God rests? And the Israelites understood it's not that God is inactive on this day. They understood that he continued to sustain creation. As the giver of life, they understood babies were born on the Sabbath day.
Right.
It's not that God was inactive, but this idea of setting apart the seventh day wasn't a part of creation. He was. I'm gonna kind of make a funny phrase here. He was making time for us, right? He was creating this space for us to have. And Jesus then in the Gospel of Mark, and so I haven't been making a lot of these New Testament connections other than just kind of mentioning them, but this one I find fascinating. You'll remember Jesus got in trouble on the Sabbath all the time. He was.
Yes.
The religious leaders did not like, he would heal on the Sabbath day, and they didn't like that. The kinds of healing he did, particularly, because they would act in a way to preserve someone's life on the Sabbath day. But if you notice in the Gospels, it's interesting. Whenever Jesus is healing on the Sabbath, it's typically someone who's been in that state for a long time. Like I think about an
infirmity that's not like a death. Like it's not
exactly. It could wait till the next day. It's
right.
The one I remember the most is in John, of course, the man at the pool of Bethesda, 36 years he'd been laying there, right? He could have handled another day, but Jesus heals him on the Sabbath, and of course he gets caught because he's carrying his mat, and the people are like, the religious leaders, don't carry your mat on the Sabbath day, and so he was getting in trouble for that. Here's another account where Jesus gets in trouble on the Sabbath day. This is verse 23 of Mark chapter 2. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. I don't know, you weren't you were kind of born in the countryside, weren't you? Or you lived in the countryside when you were younger?
I lived in the urban areas of the countryside.
Well, I lived on a farm.
I did not live on a farm, but
and I can remember going, through, and you could pick, like, especially soybeans we'd pick, and you'd open them up. But wheat, you can kind of do this, and you blow the chaff off like that, and you can eat the kernels. It can have a nutty flavor to them. And so that's what the disciples are doing. I don't think they're sitting here. It's not like, they're sitting here harvesting, right? But they're just walking through casually, and they're eating as they go. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? You're not supposed to do this on the Sabbath." And of course, they made this big deal. We've talked before about how they set up these regulations to make sure, what is it to work on the Sabbath? What can you do? Mm-hmm. What can't you do? How far can you walk? What are you allowed to do? All kinds of different regulations regarding this. Here's Jesus' answer when he says, why are they doing what they shouldn't do on the Sabbath? What's unlawful? He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread." We're actually going to talk about the consecrated bread later.
Bread,
because, that's part of Leviticus here. We're going to see. Ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, and this is the part that I really wanted to pay attention to, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even on the Sabbath." So he claims his authority over the Sabbath. I'm Lord even on the Sabbath. But this idea that the Sabbath man was not made to serve the Sabbath day, right? In other words, God did not create man so that he could observe the Sabbath. But he made, you see, there's that idea that he created this time for us. We were already created on the third day, right? Or sixth day, whatever day.
Third Day was a great band back early mid-90s.
It was sixth day, yeah. Sixth day. Jesus rose on the third day. I always get those confused. But anyway.
AI might have a chance.
They'll be confounded. You certainly have a dizzying intellect. But he made this time for us, right? He created this space for us. And so I think that statement to me that Jesus makes, the Pharisees, that was their whole thing. It was like, we've been made slaves of the law. Like our whole being is about keeping the law. And I think the attitude, not just with this one, but with all of it, is no, God gave us these boundaries for us. He gave us these things for our good, right? And I think that may be a good kind of overarching thing as we think about this whole book of Leviticus. So I wanted to take some time and do that. Yeah,
and we've talked about this before, like the role the Pharisees played, that, like, coming out of Babylonian exile, there was kind of this switch of like, hey, we were way too loose with the law.
Right.
And,
look
now you're coming back to that.
Yeah,
and look where it got us. And now we're coming back to this. You've missed it on both sides. Yeah. You've missed it on both sides, and that's where the Pharisees are still landing at this point.
Yeah, I think so. You understand it. That's what I always say. I think if I always want to understand. Well, now I'm going to get really make big, broad statements. But, today we have such a hard time having a conversation with someone we disagree with. And I think you have to be able to really understand someone's point. You have to get to a place where you can at least understand why they think that, even if they think differently than you, right? Otherwise, it's very difficult to engage with someone, I think. That's what I appreciate about some of the, we've mentioned Justin Brierley's podcast. I was listening to that again yesterday, and I was thinking he's really gracious, even to these atheists that he's directly disagreeing with, but he's trying to understand their point of view. And I think that it would serve us well to do the same thing. Anyway, here's the point is we often vilify the Pharisees, but you understand what they're trying to do. What they're trying to do is they're saying, look where this got us before. Now it becomes a big deal, and it becomes kind of a contest, where Paul's saying, I was a Pharisee of Pharisees. I was among the top because I was so zealous for the law. And it became an end in itself. And that was the problem.
Yeah.
But just this idea that instead it's interesting if we look at these laws and we think, no, they were created for us, for our benefit. So, yeah, good point. So here's the next one. This is Passover. This is verses 4 and 5 I'm going to read. These are the Lord's appointed festivals, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed time. So it's kind of that repeated thing we're going to see at the beginning of these. The Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. Now, the first month in Hebrews, Nisan, Nisan, not Nissan, but Nisan. Nissan's a car. But
thank you. We are not sponsored by them. You don't need to say their name.
On the 14th of Nisan, then this is the beginning of this. On the 15th day of the month, the Lord's festival of unleavened bread begins. So we talk about Jesus' crucifixion being on the 15th of Nisan. We can date that very exactly. Jesus partook in the Passover meal with his disciples on the day before this, right? And so this is that what's going on there. So then the festival of unleavened bread, which we'll talk about, very closely connected Passover. In fact, I'll go ahead and read this. The festival of unleavened bread begins. For 7 days you must eat bread made without yeast. On the first day hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. For 7 days present a food offering to the Lord, and on the seventh day hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. So Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread are connected here. Passover begins this week-long celebration. So Passover, of course, is connected with the historical events of the Exodus. Mm-hmm. If you look back in Exodus 15, you see all those kind of things that are going on. Even actually back to chapter 12, it talks about the meal. But it is connected to those events. You might remember one of the things that the Israelites were to do is they were to take a lamb, and this is back in Exodus, without blemish. They were to kill it and take the blood. And this is where the word Passover comes from. They're to put the blood on the doorpost, and it says the death angel will then pass over you. And that's the whole origins of this. So Passover, the way it was commemorated, the way that Leviticus here commands us to be commemorated, is that the Israelites would take a lamb and they would roast it, and they would have this meal together. Now, as time went on, not only did the Pharisees add different parts to the laws, to the regulations, but this ritual became more codified, where they had things that they would do. They had certain other parts of the meal that they would take, but it goes all the way back to that. You might remember there it talks about you're to be ready to go. You're to have your shoes on your feet. You're to have your cloak on, your staff in your hand. It's basically a signal. I'm getting ready to take you out of this captivity, out of this land. And that idea of being out of captivity is then what Passover points to in the New Testament as well. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, it's said back in the historical events, it's because that they did not have time to allow the bread to rise. And so it was basically without yeast. It was without leaven. It was flat bread. And so they were to do that in order to again, remember this redemptive act. I always say Exodus is the major redemptive act in the Old Testament. And Passover was the annual remembrance of that. Very similar to, right, our annual remembrance of the greatest redemptive act in all of history, where we understand that Christ, John makes very clear, became the Passover lamb for us, that this is the symbolism that's used there. Passover is connected to the time of Jesus' death. The meal, the Passover meal became the origins of the Lord's Supper goes back to that meal that Jesus shared with his disciples. There's probably other things I'm not thinking about right now. Well,
the Festival of Unleavened Bread, and I'm just thinking about this when Jesus is crucified and the veil is torn.
Yeah.
Like there's an upsetting of this. Sure. Of this festival that was supposed to be happening right then. It's like, hey, exactly the temple curtain is torn when they were supposed to be coming to, for the festival of unleavened bread.
And that was a big deal about getting Jesus' body off the cross. The priests say, hey, we need to go and speed this up so that the land is not defiled, because they understand this special thing's coming up. And that's what it says. The Feast of Unleavened Bread was supposed to begin with the Sabbath and end with the Sabbath. So both those were days where you were to rest, you were not to work. And so this became one of those annual festivals that people would go and they would participate in. Yeah, very good. Any other thoughts or questions on that?
I don't think so.
Okay. And Paul talks about that we're always kind of celebrating this Passover now with Jesus. He's the perfect lamb that's been slain. And there's lots of that imagery, only.
Yeah. The only thing I was thinking of, I mean, I know this connects to Passover, but like even in communion, we have the bread and the juice that's still kind of connecting us to this unleavened bread narrative that we come through.
Right. It's very, very interesting. And I could say more about that. There's, Luke. So later on, and we don't know exactly when this became a part of it, but there are different, there are 4 cups that were blessed and various other things. And Luke seems to hint at this when he says very specifically, it was the cup after supper that Jesus took and blessed and said, "This is the new covenant, my blood, which is shed for you. Do this to remember me." So yeah, it's directly connected to the wine that would be taken during the Passover and the unleavened bread that would be eaten during that meal.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good.
That's good.
So let's keep going. So the next feast that would come right after this is a feast of first fruits. The Lord said to Moses, this is verse 9, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you." So remember again, Leviticus historically is set in the wilderness wanderings. It's in that month between Exodus and Deuteronomy. Exodus and Deuteronomy, make sure I got that right. Well, we talked about that in the first episode.
Yeah.
And so he says, when you enter this land, then you reap its harvest, bring to the priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. He's to wave the sheaf before the Lord, so it'll be acceptable on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath. So this becomes the first fruit. So the very first part of your harvest is celebrated. So this is the spring harvest. There's 2 different harvest festivals in the Jewish year. This harvest of Feast of First Fruits is celebrating, the beginning of the harvest the spring harvest that God's given us these things. This is when the wheat would be harvested. Obviously, that's what's specifically mentioned here. The next one is then the Feast of Weeks. It's often called, or we will call it Pentecost, because of the 50 days. Mm-hmm. So 7 weeks, which is 49 days, plus 1 after this was the feast then of Pentecost, 50 days after this first fruits. This is 16 through 21, if you want to go ahead and read that.
Yeah. Count off 50 days up to the day after the 7th Sabbath, and then present an offering of new grain to the Lord. From wherever you live, bring 2 loaves made of 2/10 of an ephah of the finest flour, baked with yeast, as a wave offering of first fruits to the Lord. You want me to keep going?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Present with this bread 7 male lambs, each a year old and without defect, 1 young bull and 2 rams. They will be a burnt offering to the Lord, together with their grain offerings and drink offerings, a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. Then sacrifice 1 male goat for a sin offering and 2 lambs, each a year old, for a fellowship offering.
And you remember we talked about fellowship offerings back, that it was a meal that would be shared together.
Yeah. The priest is to wave the 2 lambs before the Lord as a wave offering, together with the bread of the first fruits. They are a sacred offering to the Lord for the priest. On that same day, you are to proclaim a sacred assembly and do no regular work. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, wherever you live.
So Pentecost later, and again, it's not explicitly stated in the Old Testament, but if you think about the time connected from Passover, we think about Passover as the time when the Israelites left Egypt. Then you remember they journeyed to Mount Sinai, and then Moses was on Mount Sinai for 40 days. So later on, the rabbis begin to look at those calculations, and they use this to also talk then about the giving of the law. Pentecost became a time where they remembered Moses coming down from the mountain, and giving the people the law. And then by the time this is really, other than the Gospel of John, this is the only other festival that's mentioned in the Gospels. It's actually mentioned in the book of Acts, obviously. in Luke's sequel, I suppose, to his gospel, we would say. And of course, the Pentecost then is now celebrated as Christians as the beginnings of the church.
But they didn't call it Pentecost.
No. That's that's
okay. Just to make sure everybody we're clear on that. Yeah,
it's Feast of Weeks is what that would have been referred to. Yeah, Pentecost is a Latin referring to the 50 days is the idea. So
cool.
Yeah, so next is the Feast of Trumpets, which is the beginning of the seventh month. There's a lot that happens on the seventh month, and probably at least partly because of the seven, right? We've already seen this. The Sabbath is the seventh day, right? Mm-hmm. So then the first day of the seventh month, there was to be a trumpet call. And again, that was to be a Sabbath. It's a time for a rest, a sacred assembly, another time where people are to leave their work. And it kind of marks the beginning of, how do I say this? It'd be a little bit like us, well, kind of like, not exactly, but kind of like maybe Palm Sunday, right? It's ushering in this very holy time. And so you have the Feast of Trumpets on the seventh month, the first day of the seventh month, 10th day of the seventh month, then you have the Day of Atonement, which we talked about quite a bit a couple of episodes ago. So I'll just mention again, it's the seventh month, the 10th day. Isn't it the 10th day? Am I right on that?
Yeah, 10th day of the seventh month. Yep.
And that's when it was celebrated. Adar, I believe, is the seventh month. I should look that up. But then I'll look it up here in a minute. The final thing that happened on so and I mentioned this before. You see all these feasts, right, or festivals. Some of your translations will say feast instead of festival.
Correct.
And the Day of Atonement is that day that is to be a fast, and it says that this, there's chapter 16 of Leviticus is this long form talking about the Day of Atonement. Here's a shorter, but it says the same thing. You're to abstain. You're to deprive yourself, or deny yourself is the NIV translation here. And then we have the Feast of Tabernacles, which is the fall harvest festival, which would take place after that. And what the fall harvest festival, what Tabernacles did is it reminded people, first of all, and we actually have a whole episode on the mention of the Feast of Tabernacles in the Gospel of John. You might remember us talking about that. So I won't go into great detail. If you want to go know more, go back and listen to it because it's really cool.
We'll link to it in the show notes.
Yeah, but the Feast of Tabernacles reminded the people of the way that God provided for them in the wilderness. So when they entered into the Promised Land, what they were supposed to do is they were supposed to leave their homes. Basically, they didn't live in their homes for the whole 8 days of this festival as well. Two Sabbaths. They would live in tabernacles. That's where we get the word, which tabernacle is just a fancy word for a tent, right? It's this also sometimes is called, and I always have to say this very carefully, the Feast of Booths. Something about my accent that some people misunderstand
like
me. Yeah. I actually had a student put that on a test one time. This was the Feast of Booths, was the fall harvest festival. No.
Barley's come in.
Booths or tabernacles. So you get what I'm saying? So in the wilderness, they were living in tents, right? God provided for them in the wilderness. They had manna to eat. They had quail. God provided for them. And it's, that's the cool thing about a lot of these is they're kind of reminding people of what God has done in the past. And this one is really about, we can trust God. We don't need homes, right? We were homeless before, so to speak, and God cared for us when we lived in tents in the wilderness. He can provide for us. So when they enter into the land, the connection with the fall harvest as well. So things like olives, grapes, these kind of fall crops that they would be bringing in. It was also a time kind of like I always say it's a little bit like our Thanksgiving, right? It's kind of a harvest festival, right? Where we have pumpkins and corn and, the things that we take in the fall. It's a time of celebration of God providing for them through the harvest then as well. So when they're in the wilderness, it's God providing, and then He provides for us differently now that we have the Promised Land and we have the crops that He brings. Because of the unique, I guess not unique, but the way that the what's the word I'm looking for? Meteorological conditions of Israel were as well. It's a dry season and wet season, and the wet season would happen right after this. So it also became a time where people are praying for rain. So Lord, thank you for this harvest, and also we pray that you will provide for us water for the harvest. If you want to see something cool, go to YouTube, and I don't know if we can legally link this or not, but look up dry riverbed, basically a wadi starting to run with water. And it's kind of cool. There's this video that they took of the, dry riverbeds are there all the time. Wadis is the technical term for them in Israel. But you can see off in the distance in this video, lightning flashing and it's a storm. It's happening off in a distance. It's not raining right there, but all of a sudden here comes in the distance this river coming back to life, basically. And that's what would happen in Israel with the winter rains. So they would say, "Thank you, Lord, for this good harvest, and please bring the rains now so that we can have a good harvest next year as well." So that's kind of what this is all about. And Jesus in John chapter 7, Jesus makes a proclamation directly connected with the 8th day, the most sacred day of this particular festival. Anything else on that, or
no? I think that's they have a lot of festivals, a lot of times to remember.
They do, and again, I'll say something more about that in just a minute. But yeah, it's trusting in God's provision. It's saying it's really kind of, even for us today, even Sabbath, but we're going to get into the Sabbath year in a minute. It's an anti-cultural thing, right? We live in a very utilitarian way, which says make the most that you can of every moment, right? I get advertisements all the time for this, for these calendars are going to make me more productive, right? These books, like you write down, every minute is you need this much time for this and this much time for that. We're all about utilizing our time. But God said to his people, and I think he still says to us, you need to take some time to step aside, not to think about work, but instead to think about your relationship to me and your relationship to one another and your relationship to creation itself. To remember your days, this kind of thing. And so I think that's...
Yeah, and I mean, that goes back to the whole point of being set apart from those around them. And it's used against them at some point in warfare as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But, there is something to it that I read an author that basically says, like, we shouldn't think of the seventh day as rest, as it is part of the creation process. Yep. Like, it is not God took it off, but like this is a time for us to bask in the creation, what God has, what is given, and it's not you're not resting. I think this is Andrew Root that talks about this. We shouldn't just rest to be more productive the next day. Like, it's rest to be in the moment, to be in time, and that we've oftentimes made rest as preparatory for another busy work day.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm taking this day off so I can be more productive.
Or it might be
tomorrow.
Byung-Chul Han. I don't know. It's one of those guys in there.
Sounds like something he would say.
It is.
Yeah, of course, Root quotes Han, too.
Well, yeah, whatever.
So it could be both of them.
It's a circle.
Before we leave this, too, I want to say the Jewish people still celebrate this today. And if you can go online again and look at booths in Israel, for example, and you'll see a lot of times now they're made out of plywood or whatever, but they kind of set up these living spaces outside. They don't live in their house. They live outside during this period of time, again, to kind of remember what God has done. The historian Josephus actually describes this too. Really interesting, some of the descriptions that he gives of the way this was practiced in the first century, which again is, in the time that concerns us when it comes to Jesus in the New Testament.
Yeah.
Well, so that's tabernacles. And now we have some regulations. This is Leviticus 24, 1 through 9, about the lampstand and about the table of showbread. The big thing with the lampstand is this was supposed to be lighted all the time. I think about these eternal flames that we sometimes have as memorials for us today. But in the temple, he basically says you're to bring the finest oil. Everybody was to bring the oil. I think it's probably mentioned here because I mentioned tabernacles would be a time of the oil, the olives harvest, and people would do this. It's interesting still today, and we saw this when we traveled in Israel and we walked through the Jesus Trail. There are these whole olive groves, but there are certain trees that belong to certain families. Like they don't necessarily live right there, right? All the trees are together, but then at harvest, the families will get together and they go out and they harvest these olives together. They press them and everything. And, it's kind of like some places maybe in the United States that do apple butter, or apple cider, something like that. But they press the oil. And so this would make sense that at this time, then we have the regulation about we'll bring the finest oil and make sure that the lamps never go out. That image of those lamps is one that continues throughout Scripture. In Zechariah, for example, you might remember you have the lampstand and the two trees, the olive trees, right, that are constantly giving oil. And then the author of Revelation John takes that image and he applies it to Jesus. So you have Jesus in the beginning of Revelation, you have this image of Jesus in the midst of the lampstands, and he is the one who is providing the oil. He is the tree. In Zechariah, it's the priest and the leader, the king, and of course Jesus is both of those as the Messiah, and so he is providing that that image of the everlasting lampstand, that the light's never going to go out. Becomes a big deal in the intertestamental period. I'll mention this just briefly as well with dedication, Hanukkah, that we've talked about before. And the table of showbread is basically you just take fine flour, one for each of the tribes of Israel. A loaf is made. It's to be there all week, and then the priests are the ones who eat it. Like we heard Jesus making reference to in the time of David, where David ate the bread
when he's running from Saul.
When that provided for him what he needed and his companions, and so again, that's the whole difference between the legalism, right, and the usefulness of this utilitarianism. But anyway, they were to be eaten by the priest. This was part of the way that the priests were to be sustained. So that's what that's about.
Okay.
Now we have a really interesting story about a blasphemer being stoned to death. Go ahead and read this for us, if you would, starting in verse 10. It's quite a long story. I may interrupt you a couple of times.
Okay. Now the son of an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father.
I'll just point out here as you read. You didn't know I was going to interrupt you that quickly.
No, I did not.
I find it interesting that his name is never mentioned, and I think that's very intentional here. That the person who does the blasphemy, his name is never mentioned. So notice the way that they refer to him here as you go back.
Well, is this kind of like a thing we already know we're in trouble when it's the son of an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father?
Well, one of the themes in Leviticus, I want to be careful here.
Yes, I know.
Because God made provision in the law, and from the beginning, from the beginning, a foreigner could become a part of the people of Israel. It was never about blood, right? Mm-hmm. And the only reason I say that is there are some people who read parts of the Old Testament in a way that I would consider, I'll just be frank, say racist, where they say what God is forbidding is marriage between different people groups, and that's not really what he's doing. You have lots of examples. Mm-hmm. I mean, how many can you think of up the top of your head? There's Rahab, for example. Yeah. Ruth. There's Ruth, another good example. There's these both of those in the line of David, right? Yeah. In the line of King David. So there was always a provision made. Moses himself, right, married an African woman, I believe from Ethiopia. Maybe it was from Egypt. I can't remember. But you've got these various passages. What it's really about is about, are they worshipers of Yahweh or not? That's the issue. It's the same as, and of course, Paul's not just talking about marriage either, but do not be unequally yoked together with an unbeliever. That's really the parallel I would see. So I want to be careful when you say that. But yes, it's definitely part of Leviticus has said, we've seen this already, has said, don't do what they did down in Egypt and don't worship the way that they do in Canaan, right? That's we're in this in between. So I do think that that's probably a reference to that idea. He's bringing his Egyptian.
All right, I won't ask questions anymore. I won't say stuff.
No. You understand why I just want to be careful.
Absolutely. No, I understand. Yeah. So,
but I do think that's part of it here in Leviticus. Absolutely.
Yeah. Now the son of an Israelite mother and an Egyptian father went out among the Israelites, and a fight broke out in the camp between him and an Israelite. The son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name with a curse, so they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shelemith, the daughter of Debri and Danit. They put him in custody until the will of the Lord should be made clear to them.
I'll go ahead and just point out here.
Just point out how I mispronounce their names.
No. I got to thinking afterwards. I shouldn't have given you. But no, there's two different words there. Did you notice blaspheme and curse? Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. They have two different roots. The word there that's translated blaspheme in the NIV is kind of the idea of to cut out, or to hollow out. Mm-hmm. And so he takes the name, the divine name, and he empties it. Right, makes it. Devoid of meaning. But the other one is to treat as if it's nothing. That's the curse idea, is that he treated the name as if it was nothing at all. Now here's another example though. Later on, of course, people were so careful about the way that they used the name of Yahweh that they would not even pronounce the sacred name, the divine name, and they would use circumlocutions to get around it. But here is someone who intentionally is basically saying, I'm treating this with contempt. I'm treating the name of God with contempt.
All right. Then the Lord said to Moses, take the blasphemer outside the camp, and all those who heard him are to lay their hands on his head, and the entire assembly is to stone him. Say to the Israelites, anyone who curses their God will be held responsible. Anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord is to be put to death. The entire assembly must stone them. Whether foreigners or native born, when they blaspheme the name, they are to be put to death.
So we already had in the Ten Commandments, we have this idea that don't misuse the name of Yahweh your God. We had that already. What's being given here in Leviticus is Moses is basically asking, because of this specific case, what are we to do? How are we to treat this? And so here we have the regulations about how it's to take place. It's serious enough that basically all the people who hear him say it are supposed to be witnesses, right? It's not just a matter of 2 or 3 witnesses here, as it is other places. Everybody who hears him blaspheme is supposed to come and lay their hands on his head and testify to what he said. And I think we're talking here about the severity, how seriously they treated this. And then it says the hands, again in Deuteronomy, it says the hands of the ones who were witnesses are to be the first to pick up the stones. Here it says the whole assembly is supposed to stone them, right? Mm-hmm. And again, it just shows how serious this was taken.
I think what's interesting, and I know this is a different thing, but thing that popped in my head is the laying their hands on his head. This is what we see with the sacrifices as well. You go lay your hand on the head of the animal.
Right.
Anyway,
transference of the sin. This is his sin's going to be upon him. Is kind of the idea. Yeah, I don't have a good answer. I've studied this, and I don't have a good answer as to why it's right here. What I normally see is, again, you got to remember this was a chronological thing. This was in this month, and there are those who say that this is when it happened, like chronologically. In the middle of this giving of these decrees is when we have this fight. But what I think it emphasizes in the book of Leviticus is, again, that just this is serious stuff. You don't treat the Lord your God lightly. This is something to take very seriously.
All right. Anyone who takes the life of a human being is to be put to death. Anyone who takes the life of someone's animal must make restitution, life for life. Anyone who injures their neighbor is to be injured in the same manner. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The one who has inflicted the injury must suffer the same injury. Whoever kills an animal must make restitution, but whoever kills a human being is to be put to death. You are to have the same law for the foreigner and the native born. I am the Lord your God.
So this is the lex talionis and eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, this kind of thing. Particularly here, you notice life for life, and that the only thing that can stand for taking a life is for that person's life to then be forfeit. Again, the seriousness of this. What I've really been struck by, again, I'm going to mention this Justin Brierley that I was just listening to yesterday, the podcast we've mentioned a couple of times, which is the surprising rebirth of belief in God. One of the things that it's really about some of these people who were kind of in this new atheist movement, very, very strong against any believers. And for a few of them, what really turned them, and it's really basically talking about how many of them have found that belief system to be bankrupt. And for a couple of them, it's the ethics. And that's what I found really interesting. The one lady that I heard being interviewed yesterday in one I was listening to was basically saying she went to this, what's his name? Pete, I want to say Seeger, is that? Anyway, one of the authors. She went to a lecture. He's an ethicist. And
Peter Singer.
Singer. I said Seeger.
I was going to say,
Singer's a different guy.
Philosopher. Peter Singer. Yeah. Whoa. AI's got you, bro.
I'll confuse them. But Singer was giving a lecture on ethics, and basically she's sitting here going, because one of the things he's talking about is animals, and he talks about people with disabilities and
consciousness, and
she's basically saying there is no room here, which is something I've said before, in this belief system for an inherent value in human life.
Right. Yep.
Like she said, she described it. She was kind of reeling when she left that lecture because she's like, "This is what I believe, and I can't come to an ethical conclusion on this, And I found that really interesting. Anyway, it makes me think here what we have in Judeo-Christian is that value. The human life does have inherent value because we are all created in the image of God. When we look at the creation, this is for me a foundational belief, not just for me, for us as in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Foundationally, we believe all humans are created in the image of God and have inherent value. And that's, again, why I think we need to be careful about racism and any of those other kinds of things, any kind sexism. Any of those
isms,
devaluing of human life in that way.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's that story. Chapter 25 is about Sabbath years and Jubilee, and I'm not going to read all of it. I don't even know. I'll just kind of summarize. So every 7 years, God said, even the land is to have a Sabbath rest. And so you're not to plant even those things that come up voluntary. And if you've had a garden or, you've lived on a farm or whatever, even if you don't plant every year, there's a few stalks of corn that will come up or, gourds or whatever. And he says, even that's not to be harvested. Basically, you're to take this entire year and it's to be a time of rest for the land. And that's fascinating. Today, people will sometimes do this. Some organic farmers will do this with parts of their land, right? They'll divide it up. But what an interesting thought. And one of the things I have the question in our notes about what do we learn about rest from this? Not only the Sabbath day, but this idea of taking the whole year and letting the land lie fallow. I think it's against our idea that we need to milk our assets for as much as we can get out of them, right? We need to maximize. This is what corporate profits, whatever we're involved with, whether it's a small business or a large business or whatever. It's about maximizing, profit. And God's so when we think about if these laws are revealing something about the character of God, God is not in that way. And I think that part of what it's teaching us is, again, a reliance upon Him. He's the one who's going to provide for us and our needs. And so that's what I think is going on here. Jubilee is a little bit of a controversial topic. In Jubilee, it's after 7 sevens, there's to be proclaimed a year of Jubilee. And there's 3 different ways that this is understood. Some people understand this to be just a short period of time, not an entire year, but the Jewish calendar was a lunar calendar. And so every once in a while you'd have to insert a month to move it so that your spring didn't suddenly become fall, right?
Right.
And so some people think that that's what this Jubilee is about. It's about putting these 50 days in to kind of move the calendar back and reset it. And during that period of time, it was to be a time of not only was the calendar reset, but it was to be a time of freeing slaves. It was to be a time of giving people back land. And I'll say more about that in just a minute. Some people understand this as the seventh, like the 49th. Other people understand it like the day of Pentecost. So it's Jubilee on the 50th. So it's the year after. And that seems to be the plainest reading of the scriptures here, is that after 7 Sabbath years, then you were to have a year of Jubilee. And that was when, if you had sold land because of becoming destitute, becoming poor, then at that end of that would revert to your family. That would go back. And this was kind of God's way of making sure that the Israelites were not going to ever get themselves into a servitude, into becoming slaves forever. Permanent slaves, right. It was to kind of be a reset, if you will, that there'd be a limit. Yeah, I mean, you could have misfortune and get into really difficult situations, but there would be a way for you to recover from that. It wasn't to be long-term,
your children wouldn't be paying your debt.
Yeah, generational kind of thing.
Generational debt. Now,
go ahead.
Now, if I remember this correctly, we don't have any record that this actually was ever celebrated.
So now there's debate on that as well, but it doesn't seem like it was done. But you're exactly right. I was going to mention that. It doesn't seem like it was something that was practiced at least regularly. But again, when we look at Leviticus, the primary thing I think we're looking at is to ask the question, what is God's intent in this? What is God teaching us about himself, right? Especially as Christians, that's why we're not looking at it, well, how do we put this into practice? But it's much more, what does this teach us about who God is? And I think it says something about his compassion and not wanting anyone to get into a situation where they can't get out of, right? Is not taking undue advantage. In fact, he does say this. We have the sale of property down in verses 25 through 28, but look at this in 29 through 34. This is Leviticus chapter 25, 39 through 43. I'll read just a little bit of this. So there's different kinds of slaves that are mentioned here. This is about making a slave out of your brother Israelite. A brother or sister Israelite. Here's what it says in verse 39. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They're to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and to the property of their ancestors, because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt. They must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. And this is something that God goes back to over and over again in the law is, you were slaves in Exodus, and I brought you out of that, right? So now you're my servants. you're to be subject to me, but you're not to make servants out of one another. Another place, and this is something, again, that's they still talk about to this day, is you're not supposed to put your fellow Israelite, make them pay interest, right? You're not to put them into kind of debt where they're paying interest. And so there's still those who hold that, they'll charge interest to other people, but not to their to their fellow Jew. And so it's another part of that law. Anything else on Jubilee, or you said what I was going to say, that basically we
have
don't
no
know that
record
they ever practiced.
Well, it's
pretty remarkable, right?
Yeah.
To think about. So, but it's basically about not taking advantage, right? It goes along with that idea of God's call for being just, for treating widows and orphans. He thinks about those who are in difficult circumstance, and makes provision for them.
Well, and I think this was the hardest one for well, I mean, even as you think back with Ezra's reforms after they come back from Babylonian captivity, and we have the Pharisees who are like, man, we got to follow the law. We got to follow to the. We still, at least from what we've discovered, there's not a record of this year of Jubilee being celebrated. You know, because I think it. You know, it's one thing to go, I'm going to go celebrate this for a week, and I'm going to take my olive oil, and I'm going to take my animal. It's another thing to say, like, hey, my family maybe potentially has accumulated this wealth, you know, in this land, and it's all in our, and then kind of go, nope.
Got to give it back.
You got to give it back. And so, you know, that is the, Yeah. You can see the turmoil in their hearts and some of this.
But again, it's a different kind of economy, right? It's a different way of thinking about our relationship to the creation. It's not to be used, how do I say this, to amass great wealth. And that, you know, even the kings, God said, I don't want you to get a bunch of horses out of Egypt, right? I don't want you to amass large amounts of gold, Solomon. You know, I want you to you know, continue to be humble to a certain extent as you lead these people, right? So here's all I'll say. Chapter 26 is blessings and curses, similar to what we see in the book of Deuteronomy. We see a repeated blessings and curses. This is a little bit different. It begins by saying, do not set up idols or make an image or sacred stone for yourself. Do not place a carved stone. So again, worship only the Lord your God. Don't worship these idols. Don't do this. And then he talks a lot in this chapter about observing my Sabbaths. If you do these things, if you carefully keep the law, then I will send rain in season, the ground will yield its crop, the trees will bear fruit, your threshing will continue until grape harvest, the grape harvest will continue until planting. You'll eat all the food you want and live in safety in your land. I'll grant peace in the land, and you'll lie down, and no one will make you afraid. So he basically gives all these great blessings if you keep my Sabbaths, if you do these things. He finishes that section in verse 13. I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of Egypt, so you would no longer be slaves to the Egyptians. I broke the bars of your yoke and enabled you to walk with your heads held high. And then we have instead, on the other hand, but, verse 14, if you will not listen to me and carry out these commands, and if you reject my decrees and abhor my laws, fail to carry out all my commands, and so violate my covenant, then I will do to this to you. I will bring you sudden terror, wasting diseases, fever that will destroy your sight, sap your strength. You'll plant seed in vain because your enemies will eat it. I'll set my face against you so that you'll be defeated by your enemies. Those who hate you will rule over you, and you'll flee even when no one is pursuing you. And it goes on and on and on. You know, about sins, about the plagues that will come. And so, you know, in all of this, we have the conditional nature of the effects of following the decrees and laws that God has given. You know, from the beginning, God's promise to his people, how do I say this? He gave it initially, right? He offers it freely, but there are conditions that come along with maintaining that. And that's what we see here. And like I said, the same way we have in Deuteronomy.
Yeah, I just kept thinking about, like, you know, he's going to provide all the stuff. It's manna for them in the promised land. Like,
exactly.
I'm going to keep providing for you. And then it's also kind of like, oh, and then if not, here's the snakes, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, bite you.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, this is a continuing theme. This is not a new theme. It's, I'm going to provide for you. You know, we got the birds, we got the manna, and now we've got, you know, and now we have the snakes and, you know, the disease. And so God lays out, here's what I have for you. And I think that's always, you know, we've talked so much about this, but understanding the choices and what's gone on and what's been in their heads for so long, this processing of them, of kind of going, God's made plain to them his plans and purposes for them, and he gives them a choice in that.
Right. That's good. That's very, very good and well stated. And all I have to say about chapters 27 is about vows.
Yep, they talk about them.
Yeah, about the kind of vows you make, and I don't have too much to say on that, but
all right, well, you make good vows.
That's Leviticus.
That's Leviticus. We're done, guys. So, Brian, what do you think is the number one? The number one thing about that. What do you think is we're wrapping up Leviticus? Yeah. Everyone's like, "Yes, thank you, it's over." What would you want to say to them? What do you think the main point here? You know, as we wrap this up,
I don't know if I can say a main point.
Not a main
quickly.
point. The bottom line. I'm just kidding.
Well, Here's
this
what
isn't
I'll
a
say.
3-point sermon.
This is still God's word. That's the first thing I'll say. This was inspired by the Holy Spirit. In fact, it was spoken to Moses by God, right? Moses went up on the mountain and he received this. I don't think God does that lightly. And in all of Scripture, we have to be equal. We joked a lot about it, and it's not one that, again, we're not going to do a 20-week series on Leviticus probably. But it is still the Word of God, and it still reveals something of His nature and character. And I do think we see that. Pragmatically, it helps us understand the New Testament when we see sacrifice, when we see Hebrews, the high priest, and Day of Atonement, and Feast of Tabernacles. When we see all that stuff, it helps us understand that for sure, just pragmatically. But I don't want to leave without this idea that this is God revealing things that are important to Him, like what we just talked about with Jubilee, and how seriously he's taking this idea of not. I would say it's not keeping someone subject in this kind of way for a long period of time. I think that tells us something about His character and nature, his compassion for His people. Not just God, not just the Israelites, but for all people, right? The foreigners among you. That's the thing I'm always struck by when I read the law, is the number of provisions that it makes for those who are foreigners in the land. God, as I said to you earlier, God from the beginning knew that there would be these people who are not native-born Israelites. What are we going to do with them? Well, there's a way that they can become Israelite. There's a process that they can go through in order to become a part of God's people. And as I mentioned, we see this with Rahab, with Ruth, with others throughout the Scriptures. Now, no, I'm not summarizing quickly, but this is still God's word, is what I want to say, and it tells us something about His nature and His character. I think we can still learn from it. I think it teaches us. We can sometimes become, in our culture, flip when it comes. We talked about this idea of the transcendent. We can become a bit accustomed to treating sacred things lightly. Mm-hmm. And I do think Leviticus, like that story we heard of the blasphemer, right? Mm-hmm. No, I'm not going to name him, and I didn't finish saying that, but he took my name in vain. We're going to expunge his name from the record, right? But it shows us what as the Hebrew writer says, what a dreadful thing to fall into the hands of the living God, right? This kind of an idea. It's something that we need to take very seriously. What an awesome thing, what it is to be, quote unquote, in fear of the Lord, not cowering. That's not what we're talking about. Not, afraid He's going to strike us at any moment, but recognizing with proper reverence that He is the Creator God of the universe and we are not. And that may be, if there's one thing in Leviticus as you read, that might be the thing that strikes me. Is He, and as I mentioned, this week, He has a different perspective, right, than we often do. Whereas we think in terms of maximizing profit, mm-hmm. He thinks in terms of properly using the good creation He's given us and caring for ourselves and caring for creation. So I guess that's what I'd say. What about you? You have anything that you were struck by?
I think I said this before, and it kind of comes to me again when I talked about laying on the hands, but just you said this, and I think the first couple weeks is just the forming. It was as much about forming the people as it was about the sacrifice itself. Like yes, it was about the sacrifice. It was about the participation in this, and it was what are they experiencing in this sacrifice with this animal, and that there is, to see that, we oftentimes read those words or read them quickly, but to see like there is a shaping here that's happening, and there's these ideas behind them, that it's not just blood and gore, but it's the blood and gore for purpose, like it is to affect the person, as well as being a part of the sacrificial system.
And obviously, that act, it's true that act sacrifice, but again, I'd say that's what the whole of Leviticus is doing as well. I think Paul was right when he said the law was a teacher, right? It was a teacher to guide us to God. And so, all along, I think all of these are kind of ways of reminding us of some of these truths that are so easy for us as human beings to forget. Again, that God is totally other, totally holy, that he is a redeeming God. He keeps reminding me, I redeemed you out of Egypt. So how should you behave, right? How should you be? Anyway, but yeah, those are interesting things. And the other thing I guess I would say, and this isn't so much what we get in the context of Leviticus, but just to remember that it has this very specific place between Egypt and Canaan, right? And I love that one line we've highlighted a couple of times where God says, you're not to worship as they did down in Egypt, and you're not to worship as they do in the land I'm taking you to. You're to be a set apart, we use the word consecrated a lot, a distinct holy people, because I'm holy, God says. And I think that's a good reminder for us too. In our society, we don't allow the society to dictate the way that we approach God. We approach God according to the terms that he has. Terms is not exactly the right word, but you understand what I'm saying, on the basis that he's given us to approach him. So
yeah. Well, I think this is all great.
Good.
We made it through. Woo. Yep. Well, I appreciate
so on
it.
to Deuteronomy now.
No. Nope. That'll be Brian's Bistro. Just kidding. No, so we'll be back next week.
Brian's Bistro.
Yeah, we're gonna be doing. Maybe we talk about maybe doing some Revelation here coming up.
Some Revelation.
Working on
some other
guests, coming up. So, Brian, thank you so much for leading us through Leviticus. I hope you all have enjoyed this, and we'll see you all next Tuesday.
See you next Tuesday.
See you. Bye.